The first reading that I'm going to be discussing this week is the Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka piece on universal basic rights for animals. And this is going to be a carryover of some discussions that we had last week, particularly in relationship to Gary Francione's piece, Animals, Persons, or Property. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started with my lecture. All right. So just to bring a few things to clarity at the beginning of this lecture, I just wanted to start by framing things the way that Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka start this chapter, right? So they're in this chapter, they're discussing a concept of inviolable rights. Okay, so inviolable rights are referring to an individual's basic interest, which cannot be violated regardless of the consequences for the greater good, right? So this is going to stand in big contrast, right, to Singer's utilitarianism, right? So under Singer's utilitarianism, which is framed around preferences, it's not about recognizing inviolable rights for animals, and certainly not for humans either, right? But Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka want to say that obviously, like Singer's been incredibly influential, and this is not to discount his work, but it seems like it's widely understood within the way in sort of the common morality of most people, right, that humans do have a sort of sense of inviolable rights, regardless of how well that's actually applied. It seems to be widely accepted, right? And so they present this kind of contrast, right? That most accounts toward improving the lives of animals are they ultimately fail on this account, right? They fail in the sense of inviolable rights, right? Because they end up caving to an account that justifies harming or killing animals based on this emphasis toward the greater good, right? So they want to say that it seems clear on their account, right, that animals are fully viable in the service of the greater good, while at the same time humans are fully inviolable. And so this sort of lays the ground for the rest of the work that they're doing in this chapter, this kind of extreme contrast. So we want to ask a question: why is there resistance to this idea of inviolable rights for other animals? And so by some accounts, right, people claim that it's self-evident, right, that humans have rights and animals do not, right? That, is it a greater loss when a human dies than an animal, right? And perhaps, right, Donaldson and Kymlicka are not necessarily going to argue against that, right? They're going to say that even if that were true, like drawing these sort of like comparative considerations still wouldn't justify violating rights. This is going to echo, right, Gary Francione a little bit, right? So, for example, right, like just because people may often find the death of a young person more tragic than an old person, it doesn't mean that we can kill the old person to harvest their organs for the younger, right? This is the example that they're using, right? Um, strict utilitarians, though, perhaps would actually differ on this front. They might argue that the right to life is going to depend on your contribution to the sort of greater good. In a consideration that's aimed towards maximizing flourishing or happiness and pleasure and minimizing pain and suffering, they might actually agree with this kind of example that Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka use in this chapter. So they put forward, so just to be clear, like Will Kymlicka has done a lot of work in the sort of human rights literature, academic literature, and so he was pretty influential in that stuff before going into a consideration of animals, right? So he's grounding this in a lot of experience in the field, and so he puts forward this discussion of the human rights approach, which is basically this argument that humans are independent centers of value. So in Kantian language, again, to go back to that, right, this would be that humans are understood as ends in themselves, right? There's a recognition of sort of intrinsic value, direct moral standing. So in contrast to, right, instrumental value, being in the service of others, right? They matter solely because they care about their lives. They are independent centers of value. And so, yeah, their right to life is independent of their contribution to the greater good. And that's really important to clarify, right? And so they can't have their interests in that life violated, regardless of whether, if doing so would result in a greater overall end or greater overall good, right? And this is what he means by inviolable rights. This is what Donaldson and Kymlicka mean by inviolable rights, okay? And they want to say that sentience is very important, right? So this idea of having a subjective experience of the world. So I'm just going to read this quote from the piece. So they say that, quote, beings who experience their lives from the inside and for whom life can go better or worse are selves, not things, whom we recognize as experiencing vulnerability to pleasure and pain, to frustration and satisfaction, to joy and suffering, or to fear and death, end quote. Okay, so these are the kinds of beings whose lives are important to them, as in our lives being important to us, right? And so these are the kind of beings that they're saying on a human rights approach, right, which they want to like widen to a consideration of animals, need protection from this sort of principle of inviolability, that their lives should not be violated in service of some other end. Okay. And so they present us with this question, then, are animals persons? And I just want to clarify again that by person, this is a stand-in that some people don't necessarily agree with, right? But there is not really another word in the legal language for this. So personhood is simply a stand-in for selfhood, right? Um, and so this is like needs to be clarified that personhood is a legal and political term in this sense, not a species specific term for humans, which is oftentimes understood as, right? And Donaldson and Kymlicka think it's useful to use this as a synonym for personhood, right? Because if there's no other existing language and legal considerations for other animals, what are we going to do, right? Okay, so why would it just be humans that count under this kind of approach to rights, to inviolable rights? And so, Donaldson and Kymlicka bring up a couple of questions here, right? Like, they're asking, is it focused on language? That doesn't seem to be the case, if that it's just humans that have access to language, a certain kind of language, perhaps. But there are definitely many animals that have something akin to a language, right? Abstract reasoning, and this is certainly something that cognitive ethologists, animal behaviorists will say definitely exists in many species, right? What about culture? This has already come up a little bit in this class, but certainly there are many other species have something like a culture, sort of set of traditions and kind of like behaviors that map onto what we typically think of as culture in the human context. So in the Pacific Northwest, orcas are a great example, right? You have populations of orcas that have distinct ritual behavioral practices, right? Distinct hunting practices. That they have a preference, right, in some groups for eating fish, whereas some groups will eat marine mammals, whereas some will eat more like deep sea animals like squid and so forth, right? And this will vary from group to group, and they'll have unique language, unique calls within each group too, right? So something akin to a culture, right? And then moral agency. This is another question, right? And also, right, this has come up a little bit already too. The sense of like altruism between members of a species, something that many people taking a sort of evolutionary account of morality will argue resembles. This is like a proto kind of morality, right? These sort of like practices of kind of like hidden altruism among animals of the same species, often sometimes within across species, right? But these sort of behaviors could be considered a kind of moral agency, right? Um, and so they say that this idea of like selfhood, someone at home, right? This idea that they use the term someone at home, is that enough, right? This is part of the consideration. Do we need that plus a kind of cognitive complexity? This seems to be some of the arguments that are being made against a sort of, inviolable rights approach to other animals. And so they bring up what is called the argument for marginal cases, right? And so this quote is a key kind of articulation of that. And they state, quote, any attempt to draw a line between selves and persons will cut across the species line, treating some humans and some animals as persons while relegating other humans and other animals to the status of mere selves. So the thought is, if we apply this logic of exclusion of inviolable rights for other animals, right, this is going to exclude it's going to exclude many humans and perhaps all humans at some point in their lives. And I'll get back to that in a little bit shortly. And so I think this is a real key claim for them, right? That this argument that, that there needs to be like a clear metric, right, in terms of like who meets a requirement for rights that's based on something like access to language, or this idea of a culture, moral agency, and so forth. They say that this actually goes in contrast to the way that rights are at least commonly understood, right? That vulnerable humans, again, let's just think in the context of humans. When we say that vulnerable humans are actually those that inviolable human rights are presupposed to protect. They're the ones that are supposed to be most protected by rights, right? So if you're going to seek exceptions based on a lack of capacities such as language, abstract reasoning, moral agency, and so forth, that's going to exclude many humans, and in fact all humans at some point in their lives. And why is that the case, right? And this is something they make quite clear, right? That we are all infants, we are all young children at some point in our lives. Some of us will in older age become senile, and there if we have this sort of like metric, right, then rights are only going to apply to us at some points in our lives, right? The sense of inviolable rights are only going to apply to most humans or actually all humans on their account at some points of our lives, right? And it's going to exclude some of the most vulnerable humans for their entire lives. And that seems like a real big problem, even if we're not considering that it's excluding animals. That seems like a real big problem in the context of humans, right? And so I'll just read this quote again from them. They state that, quote, the idea that inviolable rights are grounded in the capacity for language, moral reflection, or abstract cognitive ability strains common sense and seems disconnected from any plausible account of how we actually reason morally. So think about this and think if they're making a convincing argument here. Is this drawing attention to perhaps some serious problems, not just in the context of other animals, but also within the context of humans? Right. And so again, just stayed within the context of humans, they're saying that, human rights are going to become flexible, right, in this sense, based on an appeal to a required capacity for something like moral agency or reasoning. And again, this is flexible across different humans, but also across time, right? Referring back to the idea that at some point in our lives, we may not meet this metric of what is required to have access to rights, right? And so they state, quote, that to ground human rights in the possession of personhood in this sense would render human rights insecure for everyone. Okay. And also think about this example that they use of the more cognitively advanced alien species, and think if that is really sort of alarming to think about in this context as well. Would we still apply this logic in the case of a more advanced, more cognitively advanced alien species, right? Okay, and so some people again will like make this argument that it's not really about the actual kind of like cognitive capacities of particular humans or the access to culture and language and so forth, right? They'll make this argument of like species potential for personhood, right? So what does that mean? That means in general, right, that there is a potential to access these capacities in humans that does not exist in other animals, right? And that again, right, that's going to be problematic, right, because there are certainly many species that have this potential already, right? And so they also say that, there are some people, right, that will just go and, as they say, bite the bullet, right? And they'll just claim that, this actually needs to be considered outside of, cognitive capacities or other capacities that humans supposedly only have, right? Because, right, once you start critically engaging with this, this sort of logic falls apart. So, like, in response to that, some people who want to claim that rights should only exist in the context of humans will argue that basically membership in the human species is where rights are based, and it's outside of actual or potential or species specific capacities. It is just simply that by virtue of being human, you have inviolable rights and other animals do not, right? And so this is quite clearly speciesism, right? A form of discrimination in which you are taking the arbitrary category, at least on this account, of Homo sapien, and saying that by virtue of being human, by virtue of being a human being, I have access to rights that other beings do not. Okay. And so continuing on, I'll just read this quote as well. Donaldson and Kymlicka state that inviolable rights are not a prize awarded to whichever individual or species scores higher on some scale of cognitive capacities, but rather a recognition of the fact that we are subjective beings, and as such should be recognized as having our own lives to lead, right? And so they want to say that, so they want to say that really, like, these sort of demanding conceptions of personhood that are, like, arguing for a certain metric that you need to meet to have access to inviolable rights, to have access to personhood on this account, right? This brings into question, based on what we've just talked about, this brings into question the security of rights for humans, right? And this is even outside of the consideration of animals, but certainly, of course, right, it brings into question the security of rights for animals, right, which are typically not applied, right? And so Donaldson and Kymlicka want to say that based on this argument, right, that animals have inviolable rights or should have inviolable rights tied to their sentience or their selfhood, right? And this is, again, the subjective experience of the world. And this is where they want to say it's grounded, okay? And there's some question, this always comes up, right? There is some question about which animals count under this approach, right? And so, yeah, again, right, gray areas in terms of consciousness are inevitable, like understand which beings are conscious and which are not, right? But this is similar to an argument that many ecofeminists will make, such as Lori Gruen, who we've read already in class, that, right, that we actually really clearly know many animals that are, right? And so why would we focus on just this, like, fear of not knowing all of those that are included when we in fact know many who are conscious who are being denied these sort of inviolable rights? And this is the argument that Donaldson and Kymlicka are making. And they state the quote, right, the types of animals that are most cruelly abused are precisely those whose consciousness is least in doubt, right? Okay, so what does this mean? This means, right, like, for them, right, they're saying, like, certainly the animals that exist within industrial animal agriculture, which we talked a little bit about last week, right? The number of animals that are killed, something like at least 8 billion, right? That's a very conservative estimate, at least 8 billion in the context of just the United States, right? And that's not including marine animals either. And I just want to say that's a very conservative estimate. It is probably significantly more than that. But yeah, point being that we know quite clearly that, like, for example, pigs are conscious, are sentient, right? The cows are conscious, are sentient, right? Turkeys, chickens, right, and so forth, right? And so they also want to say, right, that, like, it's not that we need to grasp a complete understanding of the consciousness of these beings, right? They want to say that there definitely recognition of selfhood doesn't mean that we're going to completely understand other beings, right? we're going to always understand some animals more than others, but that the logic doesn't follow from that. This like failure to completely understand that the logic doesn't follow that those we understand less are therefore not due this sort of like basic rights under their approach. Okay. So in terms of responding to fears around, for example, sentiocentrism, or like, sentientism, which is oftentimes referred to in a derogatory sense, right? This idea that Donaldson and Kymlicka are presenting an approach that's excluding non-conscious or non-sentient beings, right? They present an interesting response to this, right? So the idea that this is a kind of like restrictive conception of personhood or moral standing that's excluding many beings, and so they want to respond to this question about like, what about extending moral standing further than other animals, right? Than this concept of selfhood. And you want to ask like, is animal rights theory anthropocentric under this approach, right? Um, and they want to say that, I'll just read this quote, that our theory is not based on any account of the essence of being human any more than is based on the essence of, say, being a dog, right? So it's not based in a sense of being human. It's based in a sense of being subjectively aware, subjectively existing in the world, conscious, sentient, right? And so they want to say that, being a self, subjective being, someone who cares about their life, or whose life matters to them, brings with it certain responses that other beings maybe do not have, certain that other beings maybe it doesn't make sense for, right? So they want to say this isn't about us, right? It's not about centering an approach based around humans. It's about centering an approach based around subjective beings, right? And it's about their lives, rather. It's not because they matter to them, right? So on that, in terms of that concern, then though, we want to ask like, what about plants? What about non-sentient life forms? What about, inorganic earth others, right? What about systems? What about categories? What about like ecological processes? And right, like going back to a consideration of like early on the term, talking about, for example, biocentric approaches centered on life, or ecocentric approaches, centered on, for example, systems, ecological wholes, and so forth, a more holistic approach. And so I want to say that, like, in responding to this and saying that you're denying rights for everything outside of animals, and that's exclusionary, they want to say that, and I'll just read this quote, that to say that humans, animals, and nature all have moral standing, or that they all can be harmed, is unhelpful. Okay. And so why did they say that? So I think, again, that this could be related pretty well to Val Plumwood's consideration of homogenization, this idea of, flattening difference. Okay. Because they say, right, that flattening differences, really, it sort of fails to account for like subjective experience, right? So something mattering to someone, a sort of like subjective experience of harm, right? And there seems to be something special about that on their account, right? This need to recognize responses based on a capacity for subjectivity, right? There's a different sort of response due for a subjective being versus other sort of beings, right? Because something can go better or worse for them in this sense, and they can be aware of it, right? And so they state that, quote, if we grant moral standing to both the deer and the ecosystem, the implication is that these are moral considerations of the same type, to be weighed against each other. This way of framing the issues obscures rather than clarifies the moral factors at work, right? So these are very different sorts of considerations, right? And it's not that they want to say that there's like zero moral standing for anything outside of animals, right? Or subjective sentient beings, right? But they want to say that those are a different sort of moral consideration. And they probably want to say something like that they don't have direct moral standing, right? That they don't have like this sense of intrinsic value, right? And they want to say that this is actually a kind of anthropomorphism, really. Like they want to say, like, okay, so on one hand, you're arguing that a rights-based approach is anthropomorphic, right? But they're going to turn around and say, actually, the contrary, where you're applying rights that make sense in the context of subjective beings to beings that don't have a capacity for interests or preferences, by applying a rights-based approach to those kinds of entities, right? That is a kind of extreme reinforcement of anthropocentrism, and extremely problematic on their account, right? And they want to say that it emphasizes that, you know, this is like, I want to say again, right, that they're not necessarily saying that these other beings don't have moral standing, but they're saying it doesn't make sense to apply a rights-based approach to them. So I just want to make that absolutely clear. And their biggest, I think the key point here that they're making is that this really reinforces anthropocentrism because right, why does it do that? Because let's apply the logic that they discuss here in the end of the chapter. They say, like, what happens when to our reasoning when we sort of substitute humans in conflicts between animals and ecosystems or holistic categories, right? So, right, if you're saying that the deer in the ecosystem represent the same kind of moral consideration, right? What happens if you substitute a human for that, right? What happens if you substitute a human for the deer, right? And so this is pretty fascinating, right? So they're saying that, like, the default assumption is always going to be that humans have inviolable rights, at least on most people's accounts. If you were to substitute a human for the deer, um, the default assumption within, you know, ecological discourse is going to be that, okay, well, no, we're not going to like prioritize ecosystems over humans, right? Because humans have inviolable rights when it comes to such conflicts. But that's only, so the point that they're trying to say here is that it actually reinforces this really strong anthropocentrism, because it's saying that only humans have inviolable rights in this account. Okay, like only humans have inviolable rights. And so I'll just read this quote from them. They say that, quote, "It is misleading to suggest that humans, animals, non-sentient life forms, and inanimate nature all have interests in the same sense, and hence that all have moral standing. On the surface, it appears to challenge the anthropocentric privileging of human beings, but in fact, it presupposes a hierarchical concept of moral standing in which only one group of vulnerable individuals, namely humans, are inviolable, while all other animals are subject to trade-offs," right? So they want to say that denying a recognition of inviolable rights in other animals actually really and sort of saying, so like, not denying, but saying that it should only apply to animals. They're saying that if we were going to apply a rights-based approach to all of nature, right, that's going to actually like really reinforce the anthropocentrism, right? Because in every sort of conflict situation where we treat, you know, the violation of the rights of humans or violation of the rights of animals the same as the violation of the rights of nature, for example, or an ecosystem, right? It seems like, yeah, we're going to treat the animal and the ecosystem as the same sort of consideration. But as soon as we substitute humans, then of course humans' rights are not going to be violated, right? So on their account, that's where this sort of like extreme anthropocentrism comes out, right? This extreme reinforcement. Okay. So they want to say that, you know, justice is owed to selves, right? So justice doesn't make sense for them in the context of non-subjective, non-sentient beings, right? Rather, justice makes sense in the case of subjective beings who can have an interest of their own, right? And that there are, you know, unique vulnerabilities that stem from sentience, and these sort of needs lead to a kind of claim on their part that there needs to be a recognition of inviolable rights, at least in these kinds of subjective beings. And right, so I just want to reinforce this again, right? That like this is not a discounting of the moral standing of nature per se, right? But it's rather, on their account, rather they're saying it's a recognition of distinctions which are important to recognize, and we don't want to flatten that difference, right? We want to say it doesn't make sense to think about, for example, a tree or an ecosystem in the context of you know, being subjects of fairness, someone that can be treated unfairly, right? Because on their account, right, they're not a someone, right? At least in the sense that they're not sentient, they're not subjectively aware, on at least by every account that we seem to look to, right? On their account, they seem to say that, right, they are not subjects of fairness in a sense. And so in this sense, they're saying this is not about like subordinating the rights or the interests of other beings lower than animals and humans, right? They're saying it's not subordinating because they do not have interests, they're being taken less seriously, right? They're saying it's not about saying that the interests of ecosystems or the interests of plants and trees matter less than the interests of animals and humans. It's about claiming that it just doesn't make sense to think about interests in the context of these kinds of beings, right? So, at least on their account, they want to argue that this is not hierarchical, okay? And they say that like there's a really what's really important too about subjective sentient beings is that there's a potential for intersubjective relationships, okay? And this needs to be recognized. We need to draw distinctions, right, as they say, between one-sided relationships, as in relationships with, for example, they want to say like a rock or an inanimate object or perhaps even a tree, right? And the possibilities for like intersubjective relationships, which are perhaps not fulfilled with many other animals, but there is at least a possibility for an intersubjective relationship with most other animals, right, on their account. And they want to say that we need to be as mindful about emphasizing difference and separateness from other animals, as in generalizing as the other, right, as overemphasizing closeness and sameness, which is anthropomorphizing, right? So both sides of that need to be taken seriously, right? And as I already said, like there's a lot of concern here with flattening difference, which is flattening the difference between like all of nature, right? There's a lot of diversity within nature and different kinds of beings, which need to be recognized as the sort of beings that they are on their account, right? And certainly on their account, right, subjective sentient beings need to be recognized in a certain way. They should be granted on their account a sense of inviolable rights, right? And so I think this relates pretty well to this critique that Plumwood makes in terms of her discussion of centrist reasoning, and in particular the concept of homogenization, or the sort of like flattening of difference, the taking of the like categorization of vast numbers of distinct beings as being sort of the same, right? So think about this in the way in which, you sort of say you've seen one particular animal and you've seen them all of a particular species, right? Again, this concept of species thinking, which will come up again in our in week 7, the discussion of ethical issues related to conservation, okay? And they want to say it's really important for us not to draw this hard distinction between sort of humans and other animals that sort of like reduces all animals to nature, right? That there's something distinct about the subjective experiences of the world that exists within within many animals, okay? Yeah, so with that, I'm going to conclude this lecture, and I'm going to be talking about Ava Meyer's chapter on goose politics next. So thank you.